Yeah, go for it.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Active Inference Institute, the textbook reading group, which we hold twice every Thursday. And this is the latter group, Cohort 8, reading Chapter 1, second week of that. And so we're being introduced to Active Inference. This is with Chapter 1, it's one of the shorter chapters of the book. Of course, it's just opening things up so it doesn't jump too quickly to, say, any complex formalisms or the definition of expected free energy just yet. We're largely just introduced to sort of the broader outlook of active inference as a normative framework for approaching uh, behavior, action, inferential processes with a foundational sort of neural process theory and functional, that is free energy and free energy minimization. So uh, quickly we move to looking at living organisms, or another more kind of abstract notion of that, which we now hear all the time for those who work in AI and tech, agents, as a sort of general notion of what could be an organism, a system of interest that exhibits behavior, or otherwise. Um, Agents take in sensory observations and elicit actions to either one, realize their desired outcomes or goals, or two, to make further sense of their world by gaining information. This general overview leads to the development of adaptive behaviors or strategies agents use for navigating their environment. And this process plays out in a recursive action perception cycle, where observations inform agents' decision making regarding the next action they should take. While we may in future often view this as a kind of discrete setting where there are multiple time steps or cycles where you could simulate an agent, in reality, we tend to view these more as continuous processes, as we're aware that much of active inference actually derives from not just the conceptual work and mathematics, but the direct empirical work Friston and others have done whenever it comes to working with neuroimaging data and dynamic causal modeling and other forms of looking at continuous processes over time and linking them with observed behavior. So these inference processes or action perception cycles can occur at various levels of complexity and timescales, from the simple and rigid moment by moment strategies of nutrient seeking bacteria to the more complex and flexible strategies of humans engaging in planning to realize their goals in the future, potentially all the way up to broad cultural and developmental learning in collectives and societies. So they give us an interesting sort of way of viewing active inference, and perhaps why they might justify introducing it as a fully normative framework. And so they frame it as follows. Active inference's approach is on the side of the scruffies, while scruffies lay emphasis on the neats, while scruffies lay emphasis on the idiosyncrasies and specificities of various phenomena of interest, such as different biological adaptations, neuronal dynamics, or cognitive mechanisms, each deserving separate bottom-up research from empirical data. Neats aspire to a set of first principles for explaining and relating these phenomena in a more top-down fashion while still engaging in empirical analysis for validation. Active inference also identifies with needs as it lays a normative framework for understanding the brain and mind, their biological and cognitive implications, alongside model design, testing for empirical analysis. This is frequently noticed if anyone begins to look at journal articles or other publications from active inference, where, sure, there are many times where people are modeling and remaining within an artificial environment, or they may even be intending to design something that could be used in the realm of robotics or artificial intelligence. That said, there are many other behavioral studies done, such as the realm of computational psychiatry or classic lab studies with mice or rodents, where there is indeed forms of model fitting and revision of the model based upon the actual empirical data that is collected. Shouldn't leave out also other continuous state space and hybrid state space examples, including studying things like eye saccades and neuroimaging data, fluctuations in electroencephalography, and so on. And we do have a question. So yeah, John, go for it.
Yeah, this confused me every time I read it. Why is it called a normative framework? It seems to associate normative framework with first principles. I've never heard an association like that before. I'm hoping someone could clarify this.
That's interesting. Yeah. Is any we could open up to discussion if anyone has any thought on that. Um, Otherwise, I can go for it. Yeah. Steve.
Is this we could think of it as sort of an expression of natural law? This is a physical dynamic principle.
Yeah, I'll go for it. So, um, I mean, as far as normative in the sense of establishing a norm, my take there on this specific point is that this is in fact providing like a an attempt at a holistic framework where there are a variety of concepts that are introduced, not necessarily introduced afresh, as active inference draws from a variety of disciplines. But nonetheless, it does attempt to build up something like potentially totalizing picture of how we could view behavior, inference, and anything from biological to other physical and psychological phenomena. So, in that sense, it is drawing from first principles because it needs to establish certain principles of how to achieve that framework and maintain it, and like on which the framework relies. And then normative, I see those as rather part parcel. So that's been my take on it.
So if I switched normative for holistic, I couldn't go too far wrong, do you think?
I mean, I would say so. Yeah. Just curious though, because this might be helpful for others too. Um, I mean, what is your, because I'm looking at a quick definition of normative just to kind of lay some connection here that we can all work with. Establishing, relating to, or deriving from a standard or norm, especially a behavior. So we do have like kind of an establishment of like this is our norm that we have for viewing behavior.
Okay.
Holistic, sure, that could work as well. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and I'm sure, unless there's some British connotation or something peculiar, which is, I think, a great starting point for discussion, but it's not a declarative, so it's all just language samples. But it's like, what is normative about how things actually are? I mean, are things not as they normally are, according to like central limit theorem, in the limit of large classicalness? Things are described by norms, especially if we're not going to be interpolating secondary functions like reward functions. That has been applied even in the social scripts and expectations theory of mind. And that's not even necessarily ActInf. That's just like expectations and norms and firstness and inertia. And there just has to be an overwhelming element of things, identifiable things being identifiably as they are. So that's, and then there's a sort of interpretation of like modeling praxis normativity. Like you ought to consider multi-agent systems, but those don't necessarily have axiomatic. They might be very good epistemic hygiene or modeling strategies or machine learning or interpretability or anything like that, or performance or model efficacy or something. But it's a little different than, and also what first principles are. Stephen?
Yeah, I think Andrew did a good job of probing what the issue is. There are definitions of what normalizing is. It's a scaling, but also uh, what you're uh, referring to is the mindset, first principles. The normative first principles are, energy, entropy, principles, and that's what the way it's used here. I think it's a fundamental principle.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really well said, Stephen. It's because it's yeah, and what Daniel pointed to, you're referring to social scripts and things like that. I mean, the word normative, not that I'm necessarily an etymologist, but I mean it's been used in a variety of contexts, and I personally have like this sort of general social sciences background before I kind of took a turn into kind of the harder sciences as well as data and empirical data. Um, but normative has also been used in many contexts to refer to something that is culturally normative, meaning it's almost as if you're saying, oh, it doesn't really rely upon anything other than the fact that we do it and influence one another, such that it's a social phenomena of, that is normative in our society, but perhaps not in other societies, versus what I view active inference, which is saying, I mean, I don't want to open things up and make it too abstract, but it's kind of like it's as if Friston et al. Here are saying that we're kind of putting up this normative framework. Perhaps you choose, perhaps it's a choice that you decide to kind of borrow into this framework. At least, I mean, in our context, obviously, this is not a very authoritative command. Rather, it's just in the same way we spoke at the beginning of the session just prior, that this can be a kind of toolkit for people. It's your choice ultimately if you decide to agree with the entirety of the framework. And I honestly advise that you not do that. If you've only read the first few pages of chapter one, you should spend more time with it, as you should with anything, before fully buying into it. But I think it provides a pretty strong argument personally. You could maybe guess that given I'm here. But yeah, so there's a lot of nuance to the word normative, but I think this is in some ways it's like an offering of a full framework that's been worked on for at least a couple of decades now, and arguably longer if we kind of trace the lineage there. Um, and yeah, it's a rather holistic view.
Reading that question, that I'll put in the chat. This was just as usual. The notes are scattered, so again, it's just a starting point. But here's another interesting view was the term normative. This could have been an Aliism or something. The term normative means there is some evaluative standard against which behavior can be scored. Active inference is normative in the sense that perception and action are scored by free energy, a quantity we will unpack through this in the next chapters. Actually, maybe that's just from the book or a footnote. But that's just one way of them even saying it. So it again, it's like you can always just say, okay, does it really matter even what we think about this one English word? Doesn't it matter more what it's actually going to be, not just um zooming in only on one adjective just because we wouldn't have written it that way in our view, but giving norms and measurements, giving a measure theory of information spaces, which is more like the Bayesian mechanics view. There's a gauge and a norm and measurements that gives. But if we're not clear if we're talking about enculturation and normativity or mathematical gauge and like sheaf, then I mean then it's just too broad to be useful. It's just not a.
Yeah, I just didn't know what was intended by that word because I've never seen that word in a context like that before.
Sure, sure. Yeah. It's been used in philosophy as well at certain points to distinguish like, oh, this is a normative framework in the sense of it is making claims about something that you necessarily have to agree with in order to actually get something out of or to like properly utilize the framework. It's not used in that way 100% of the time though. So actually a lot of the ambiguity around the word normative here, yeah, just it's quite broad. Could could go many ways, but I hope, yeah. So anyway, I hope that perhaps the word holistic is a fair enough interpretation of the word. I think it adds to it if it doesn't encompass everything. It probably doesn't encompass everything. So, um, does anyone else have any thoughts or questions or anything they'd like to throw out there? Okay. Um, so in reference to some of what we discussed as well at the very beginning of the session, so this chapter, of course, remains rather brief relative to others, and as we're just being introduced, and so, of course, in a nice fashion, they're nice enough to give us the outline of the book. So the book is separated into two parts. The first half focuses on theory, which I know many will be quite interested in, as opposed to the second half. This first half acts as a broad primer, which covers active inference as a normative framework with its distinct concepts and theories. The second half will cover practice by describing examples of core active inference models with their components and examples of applications, as well as information needed for designing novel models. And what they also don't mention, it involves model analysis and potential fitting and other perspectives we can take on the modeling process itself. So we're provided a conceptual roadmap for coming to an understanding of active inference in the first half of this book, which can be followed along a low road starting from Bayes' theorem, or a high road starting from what is known as the free energy principle. So the low road especially, it supplies the mechanics of active inference and its relation to the Bayesian brain hypothesis, whereby inference is seen to work by way of Bayes' theorem. So we have, in Bayes' theorem, we have prior information about hidden states. We have a likelihood distribution describing how they relate to observations. And then we have new observations themselves as evidence, which can be brought together to all compute posterior beliefs about hidden states. Then on the other hand, with chapter 3, we'll get into the free energy principle, necessity for agents to minimize this quantity as a proxy or upper bound on surprisal in order to survive and adapt to their environment, whereby the tractable proxy allows for variational inference and can certainly relate to many notions of things like metabolism, saving of resource expenditure, actually being able to accomplish physiologically, neurobiologically, or otherwise different kinds of inference processes that otherwise may not work or be very, very strenuous to an organism to accomplish if they could actually run it in full, as if they could activate every neuron in their brain simultaneously. And then finally, eventually, we'll get to chapter 4, which gets us back on the low roads foundation in Bayes' theorem. So there will be a bit of a cross back to return to that previous material. We're introduced to two template models used in active inference, especially these two exemplars, the first being a POMDP in discrete time scenarios. And we'll also look at continuous time scenarios where we instead rely a bit more on differential equations or Taylor series approximation. In chapter 5, that's kind of the meat of active inference as far as sort of making these connections to neurobiological processes goes. We'll look a lot at variational message passing and their relationship to cortical circuitry and the sort of passing of information, as well as being able to see how some of the concepts will be introduced to along the way, such as ideas of precision and other model components relate to neurobiology in the form of synaptic gain, neurotransmitters, and so on. So from there, the chapter starts to wrap up, and we see that active inference's approach to various concepts and cognitive mechanisms, such as perception, which is changing one's mind, and action is changing the world. Learning is similar to perception, but operating at a slower time scale with longer term impact on the inference process. So we have a separation between inference and learning in this framework. Then planning is a means of selecting actions in sequences to realize future goals. If I want some food, I'm going to have to take several steps to get there, thus devising my own policy, which can then be compared to other policies. And then we also can break that up, those policies and the way I select them, in terms of exploration and exploitation. Do I want to try a new restaurant? Do I want to try something different along the way? Do I want to stop and look online at local restaurants before even getting straight to the goal of actually like attaining nourishment? So it's worthwhile to consider, like in an everyday sense, given the sort of holism of this framework. How can we relate it to everyday things? I've just seen that as being useful for as a sort of learning heuristic for people who are still new to thinking in these kinds of ways, and so on. So let's see. I think it's worthwhile to, given the amount of time we have left, it's worthwhile to just kind of open it up from there. If anyone had any particular questions they want to pursue further, they have a certain section in the textbook that particularly piqued their interest. We can always go to the questions for the chapter that have been asked historically beyond this group. So anyone feel free to recommend anything.
So the way this works is you try to update your beliefs first, and if that's not good enough, then you act to change the world.
Not necessarily. So, but that is a good question, because it's really important to clarify those two things. So in active inference, it's as if at any given moment, someone could be doing both of these things simultaneously. That is, I could be seeing something, and then I associate that with a hidden state or set of hidden states, or otherwise defining the beliefs that I have about what goes beyond what I'm seeing, like what something means, and then simultaneously I can act, right? So if I'm sitting here, I'm thirsty, and then I look over and I see that my water bottle is there, and I have a belief that I had put water in it and that it is available to me, all the way down to this highly granular level that likely involves a lot of inferential processes that I am not at all explicitly thinking about, because this is such habitual behavior for me, so I don't have to put that much effort in. But if I actually thread it out, word it in this way, there's a kind of perceptual inference process going on, and simultaneously I want water, so I'm like kind of driven towards something. So I also take this water bottle to be a kind of affordance to me that I can then proceed to act, and I could pick it up, and I could go straight for the drink, or I could actually look inside of it first to get more information about if it even has water in it or not, prior to jumping straight to the kind of pragmatic value of consuming the beverage. So yeah, if that makes sense, it's like these things can play out simultaneously, and presumably they are all of the time. So my body has a variety of circuitry within it where inferential processes can potentially be taking place, or you could view the mind as doing that in many ways through different cortical layers, passing messages between them, inferring different things, and so on. So did that give any clearer picture?
I'll add one thing that was very interesting, Andrew, is the physics like Bayesian mechanics is in terms of uh simultaneous unfolding flow dynamics, kind of like a heat bath situation with unfolding flows that might be sampled from. Whereas, especially if you're going to be writing an implementation that runs on a single core CPU, there will be some sequential logic or program flow. So there's actually a lot of degrees of freedom in between the analytical representations, which are basically unopinionated on what order you do what actual implementations. And so there's like this like OODA loop or the test operate, test exit, all these different ways of thinking about, well, does this happen first, or when does this belief updating happen? It is certainly not specified like that in the general part of the theory because it's to be specified in the specific parts of the theory.
I think it's probably also important to remember there are hierarchical orders of organization, from the on the physical level, from subatomic, atomic, up through on the biological scale, cellular systems, organism. These different levels of organization have their own characteristic dynamics. And so if you're speaking with the language of the organismal level, say the mind level of having preconceptions with constant updating based on activity, sensory and motor activity, that's a different hierarchical level than, say, on the thermodynamic chemical level, where you might want to model it differently. Implementation might be slightly different. But here's what I'm really interested in: the difference between the normative principle or the holistic framework versus the implementation, whether it's modeling, like you're saying, Daniel, on a single core system, or just algorithmically, like how to set up the implementation of what we're considering to be a general holistic, just natural law principle of how things work. And to that end, if I can circle back to the definitional clarifications we were trying to get at in the beginning, Andrew, how do you go through the metacognitive process of like doing online translations of these words, like the action and the inference, when you're applying it in a specific case or application?
Yeah. To be clear, do you mean to say in the sense of like if I were actually going to sit down and engage in some kind of cognitive modeling, or do you mean like just the literal translation a moment ago of me describing picking up a glass of water?
Yeah, either one would work. Just
Either one. Yeah. Cool. No, that thanks. And that and I'll also say that the two would kind of borrow from one another. Um, it, so maybe I can, since it is a personal question, which I appreciate, maybe I'll just go for it. Let's see. So what really helped me personally when engaging in like actually attempting to model something, which so for anyone who is interested in modeling to the degree of they want to program themselves, a lot of active inference modeling, there are growing numbers of resources and tools for accomplishing that. It kind of starts with Fristen's work in the MATLAB language and building his own SPM package for that. And I'll skip ahead a little bit and say that to actually start developing something where you can simulate an organism or agent within its environment, like actually kind of coding that up as a simulation, and then watching it play out and watching these kind of like algorithmic steps that play out. I think it's highly informative, like in that kind of intuitive sense of like, and also active inference would say this as well, right? We're not just passive observers. We actively engage with the world, including to seek information. So all I mean to say with that is by actually sitting down to do the cognitive modeling, that actually filled in a lot of gaps for me. Not to say that someone who doesn't program could never understand active inference, certainly not the case. We've had so many people who don't know how to code, and yet they have very kind of rich backgrounds in philosophy and psychology and so on. Right now, I'm working on a project with some folks at the Institute where one of them is a clinical therapist. And so I'm kind of playing the role of the computational psychiatrist, where we're devising a model together, which relies upon active inference, foundational kind of first principles perspective on how to do this. and then the clinical therapist has recorded information from anonymous, well, they know them, but redacted from the final study, participants they engaged with, who all of whom had were diagnosed at one point with PTSD. So whenever I sit down to think about how to model that, and of course this is very sensitive subject matter, so I don't really take it lightly to just sit down and think, oh yeah, I can just make a person who exhibits all the characteristics of PTSD in one sitting, let alone like, I would want to fit that model to real world phenomena, for example, obviously. So all of that said, I guess with perception and action, like I said earlier, it tends to play out in a continuous setting in reality. But if we're going to set up kind of a sequential, like step by step, like following the classic rules of like developing models that are not too complex while still being accurate, like a kind of Einsteinian, simple as possible but no simpler sort of approach, then it becomes useful to, especially in the case of modeling a person who might have kind of these discrete beliefs with their own relative strengths. I would view it as, this is a discrete per time step, multiple time steps per trial of the simulation. I view it as like there's an action perception loop. So first, and it could have your starting point, it doesn't matter, right? It's like, presumably this loop is infinitely recurring, so to speak, until it can't anymore because something happened with your biology to where you don't exist anymore, or you've lost the part that's doing the inference or otherwise. But it would begin with something in an algorithmic fashion. It's something like an agent engages with their environment in the sense of they sense something from the environment. So they take in an observation, as it were. They could see it. It could be interoception, and they feel it, or even notice a signal coming from within. Exteroceptive sensation would be the seeing it, the more typical way of viewing it is like, oh, we have five senses and one of them is touch and one of them is taste and so on. That would be more exteroceptive. We'd also have proprioceptive in the sense of, physical movement, which, as far as we understand the brain, I mean, it has its own distinct set of dynamics and so on. In any case, you take in some kind of observation, and then from there, you update your beliefs, right? It's as if your mind is processing that information. We can imagine it very much in a real-time setting. And so it's there that these inference processes play out. What does that water bottle that I saw mean, right? And then from there, I can decide what to do about that fact. Or it doesn't have to be about that fact. It might just be that I saw it, but nonetheless, what am I going to do right now? I could choose to do nothing. I could continue sitting here, right? A null action is still an action, as it were. We're always doing something. And then the cycle just kind of, well, final important part that I'm no longer responsible for. Once I choose an action, I do that action, and then that reciprocally impacts the environment around me. So if I just sit here, you all will see me sitting here, and there's not much going on. I could jump up and dance around for no reason and upset all of my neighbors in my apartment complex. I suppose that's another thing I could do, which would then I would elicit probably an observation to me of someone knocking on my door, telling me to keep it down, or maybe they're more polite than that. But anyway, but you can see the point, right? It's like you're able to, once you kind of get the notion of the action perception loop down and get a fair intuitive enough grasp of the concepts, you can kind of start to become much more granular with it, view it as a series of processes. And then whenever you want to model something, then it's suddenly like that can give you that kind of grasp of like, oh, this is how I would model. Like this is how I would drill down into trying to understand these kinds of behaviors that I want to see, such as me looking at PTSD and getting a verbal description from a qualitative study participant who has PTSD, describing how their day tends to go, or how do they react in particular circumstances. With PTSD, it's like people get triggered. And I actually have it myself. So there's a personal interest there for me. And so to actually be able to look at the behavior and then consider like, what is happening there? What is distinct about that? And then if we start to view model parameters actually as, these kind of things, a generative model that we have that allows us to navigate the world around us and engage in different things, then suddenly those parameter values become incredibly important, because if they become too misaligned, suddenly I start engaging in different kinds of suboptimal behavior where someone else would, right? So the idea of repeatedly making the same mistake over and over, despite getting evidence showing you that you should not be doing something, or you should be doing something, right? So in that case, that it's kind of like we can start to view a model as something that is kind of just, engaging in a certain behavior, and then it's actually the parameter values and the construction of the model that kind of determine its sort of fitness or optimality for the task at hand. So you can imagine, someone who has ADHD and might have some kind of difficulty with concentrating and emotional regulation. And so whenever they try to engage in social settings, they might struggle with engaging in the conversation in the fashion that they would actually like to. Like there's a difference between what we think and what we do, right? Um, so it might be that due to particular characteristics of their neurobiology, synaptic transmission, and so on, it might be kind of preventing them or kind of skewing them towards certain kinds of behavior, both internally and externally, that don't actually meet the situation. It's around here that I think anyone who's interested in things like actually something a very different example, which is machine learning, would suddenly, like, their ears would perk up, because they'd be thinking about how this is a model that is making poor predictions. And so it's behaving in a very suboptimal way relative to the sort of purpose or intent of the model, if we could use the word intent there, because I've been talking about humans so much. So very long explanation, but I hope that was useful and maybe interesting to at least some of you. And it has been fun talking in these kinds of ways with people who are, with the clinical therapist who I'm doing the research practice, like the research group with. So yeah.
Hey, Andrew,
Yes.
in this chapter, you also mentioned it, and they don't say much about learning. And that's something I am very interested in. I came to active inference from this paper of Laura Desire Di Paolo about active inference. I think it's called Active Inference Goes to School,
Oh,
about large language models in education. So I'm like
yeah.
very interested in uh, the notion of learning in active inference, um, because it seems to me that it's like very fundamental aspect of living organisms. So maybe you can say a little bit about that, and also I don't know if it's something that goes more into detail in the next chapters, but I would like to
Yeah.
know a little bit about learning. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. No, absolutely. And yeah, I think part of why they don't go too far into learning is in part and I'll focus more on actually directly answering your question, but I think they maybe don't they dodge going too quickly into it in chapter one, just because we're already being presented with, at face value, like this is a normative framework, and it's going to take time to get up to there. And then furthermore, I think by explaining inference itself as its own process, it's a good introduction prior to getting into learning, which is where, instead of, like with inference, we update our beliefs to get these in a Bayesian framework, these posterior beliefs. It's like your prior beliefs of what you thought before versus, some kind of engagement with the world through perception or action. Then you end up with what you think after. But we can view learning as a very similar process. Perhaps it happens at a slower time scale. In most modeling, it very much is. You could almost think of it as the difference between short and long-term memory, if we put them in caricature a little bit, just for the sake of example. Um, but so learning would be like that. It will first of all, the textbook most certainly will get much more into learning. I think there's a significant amount of it in the second half of the book, because because of the kind of distinctness of it whenever engaging in actually building models and simulating them with programming or otherwise. However, it will get into it much earlier on, as well. So rest assured it'll come up soon enough. Yeah. And this is also a rather interesting looking paper. I came across this at one point because I've also do some work with LLMs, and I'll briefly mention that we've actually had talks previously with Ben White as well as Avel, who I think just did one a few days ago.
Okay.
Axel Constant, we know, Andy Clark. Yeah, anyway, sorry.
And I think also Laura was in
Yeah,
the.
it
Okay.
had one time with Laura. Um, there's also this common double usage of terms from learning, attention, memory, and like, are they being applied to the person and like the real question of human learning in a bigger form, or in its sort of narrower, just like parameter updating, belief updating, but that's not necessarily like the experiential qualia belief. But yeah, this was
Yeah.
a great paper, and it's a good direction to keep exploring.
Yeah, that's and also the question you put in the chat. It's like a very core question of to think about how this uh framework can inform certain practices uh in the case of education, but there might be another um practical cases where this framework might inform how to use certain technologies, in this case AI systems. So very, I'm gonna watch that for sure.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, it's active inference is only more ever increasingly more broadly being applied to phenomena that when I first came to it personally, I was not necessarily interested in myself. I mean, whenever I first started, I was quite new to computer programming, to machine learning, or anything along those. I keep bringing that up because active inference, it has heavy overlap with reinforcement learning, um, but also, yeah, just behavioral aspects of engaging with different things. Right now, I've been giving feedback to someone who's writing a draft on applying this quite directly to the idea of like human technological kind of interaction. We're looking at socio-technical systems. We're looking at technology as a sort of potential mediator of our interactions with one another. And it's really fascinating. And it's just the kind of concepts that come in the first part or first half of this book. With spending a little bit of time with them, they start to provide just sort of a lot of fodder, or at least initial inspirational material for thinking about these things in this way. Um, you know, when you, and of course in philosophy there are a lot of theories of things like this, like extended cognition. The idea that is the fact that an immense amount of information on the internet that can then be, transmitted and received by your phone, and then your phone being in your pocket, and therefore you have this wealth of knowledge in your pocket at any given moment. Like, what does that say about us if we do agree with this idea that we infer and learn, and at some point we end, and something else begins, like an agent in their environment. You'll see a concept later that becomes really important in active inference. There have been various discussions and even debates about it, so it's worth being aware of that. But it is called a Markov blanket. So um, I personally don't get too heavy emphasis upon the word personally. um, I don't get too caught up in the heavy specifics of it. There are many heavy, like very precise specifics about it. It relates partially to Judea Pearl's theory of the Markov blanket, but it's used a bit differently here in active inference. But one way of viewing it is simply that it's a way of kind of separating an agent or organism or whatever your system of interest is from what it is not. Because those who are familiar with any kind of modeling are surely aware, and I was too, because I did my own forms of economic modeling and kind of social science oriented modeling before I came to active inference. It's like, yeah, like I'm looking at data and information and it gets processed in different ways, and I have to decide what something isn't in order to study it. And it seems like such a simple thing. And then, of course, like for a modeler, it's like, you still have to make certain kinds of definitive statements over what your system is versus what is the not system, as I've heard some researchers say. Like you have a system and a not system. You have an agent, you have an environment, you have a generative model, and you have the generative process in which that generative model kind of interacts. So, yeah, and so with socio-technical systems and interaction between a human and an LLM. So, it's kind of
Well,
like the human. Oh yeah, go ahead.
sorry, I was gonna say that that's fascinating. Maybe I will ask you for some references regarding that because yeah, as I said in the intro, it's like I use these kind of frameworks as a lens to understand certain things, especially regarding technology. So that's why I like this paper and also work by Ben White and Ines Hipólito, because it's like a way of understanding how we embodied beings kind of interact with technologies and how we're affected by it, but also how we shape them. I think that's, but it also comes this point you're mentioning, like where does the technological environment ends and we start? And that's a good question if you are trying to think about uh, even different questions on ethics and regulations, right? Where do you put that line? And so, yeah, maybe I will send you an email for some references because I think this is very close to my work. Very, very interesting.
Cool. Yeah, no, looking forward to it. It's been a lot of fun getting more involved with the institute, and I notice folks have been asking me many questions, but I welcome them. So please go for it. And already here, and we're about to have to wrap up here, unfortunately, but I look forward to next week. But I just noticed here, LLMs could be powerful educative tools in the hands of teachers, augmenting the growing skilled capabilities of children. Here's an example of how this might look like. As a child is engaged in a writing task, rather than making auto corrections, the system could highlight mistakes, draw the child's attention, and suggest helpful resources for self-correction. So this is me not having read the paper, though I believe I've skimmed it at one point. Here's an example. A child is engaged in a writing task. There's a task. There's a goal here. We have the makings of a behavioral task or experiment right before us. Rather than making auto corrections, which would be where the LLM does something that the child otherwise would do, the system could highlight mistakes, drawing the child's attention. Attention is highly implicated in active inference. I think many people who do anything related to neuroscience, or get interested in attention at some point or another, as do those who work on modeling. In fact, people who build LLMs are concerned with things like an attention mechanism that the LLM either has within it or is, kind of is equipped with. Um, so 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 this is proposing at face value, at least, but I feel like it's rather accurate. Something like trying to devise a way of integrating LLMs such that they augment the child's ability to actually actively learn. It helps to point out where the mistake is so they can, over time learn how to identify the mistakes themselves. And then also they have to do the work to correct it themselves as well, which I think, so the notion is this is providing more fulfilling, learning experience, but then also they're really paying attention to the sort of terminology. There is a task at hand. there is something that needs to be corrected. There are attentional mechanisms in place. So, and then suggest helpful resources, like this is providing them with what we might call epistemic value or information gain, or just simply this is helping them to also learn additional information in addition to just correcting mistake. It's like, oh, here's more info that can help me going forward. And they themselves have to actually click on the link or whatever happens. You know, it's just making the suggestion. So this prevents the LLM from becoming an additional organ on the child that they now have to always rely upon, right? If you want to view it in that kind of human technology interaction, it's like instead of making this a necessary organ that you're always going to need in order to write anything, because now you're highly dependent upon autocorrect, instead it's helping to augment your education ability to write by simply giving you some starting steps on getting used to identifying mistakes and then seeking out further resources whenever you're not sure what to do. So that was my little 4 minute of a summary of a paper I still need to read myself, but it looks really interesting. So thanks for sharing this, and yeah, feel free to reach out. And then the Institute has a Discord, and so you're welcome to reach me there as well. And then I will also ideally be around for next week's textbook group as well. So
Sounds good.
1 week today. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone. So yeah,
Thank
this
you.
time slot next time will be chapter 7, discrete time, which again, interleaving them is totally good and useful. But if you want to continue with the early part of the book, then it's going to be earlier next week. So, and vice versa. So thank you though. See you all later.